I am a big fan of the James Bond films, and whether it's Sean Connery, whether it's Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, Daniel Craig, it doesn't really matter in a lot of ways because to me, the movies are so good that I'm really interested in them. But as I watched the movies over and over again over the years, one of the things I became a little bit more interested in as I got a little bit older were the Ian Fleming books that were the basis of many of these James Bond films. So I'm going to talk about one of them that I read, which also corresponds to arguably my favorite Bond movie, and that's the movie Goldfinger. I'm going to talk about the Ian Fleming book next. So as I started to read the Ian Fleming book, Goldfinger, and I should confess that I actually listened to the audio version of the book, but I think I got the same picture anyway. Even though I tend to think that reading the physical copy of the book, whether it's a paperback or it's a hardcover, is going to help with retention. At least it does with me a little bit more. But I've found that as I've listened to more audiobooks, that my retention is becoming a little bit better, and I don't necessarily have to go back quite as much to rewind things to pick up stuff that I may have missed or to get context for something that later on in the story might be a little bit confusing, and then you have to go back to get that context from a little bit earlier in the book. But as I read the Ian Fleming book, or listened to the Ian Fleming book, Goldfinger, it was really interesting to see some of the earlier parts of the book that maybe were a little bit different than what you see in the movie. And the part where I thought the movie really started to get going was much later in the book. And so it really did a good job of capturing that part of the book. But again, as always, when I talk about reading the book, when there's a movie, and so you have the movie and then you have the book, and sometimes people say it's better to read the book first and then read the movie, and there's a few people that might say, well, you know, maybe it's a little bit better to watch the movie first and then come back and read the book. So it's all just a matter of perspective, it's all just a matter of opinion. But I found typically that for me, sometimes if the movie is really good, it is sometimes okay to watch the movie first and then come back and read the book. Because sometimes what you'll find when you read the book afterward is that you've gotten to know the characters to some extent during watching the movie, and then you come back and reading the book sort of fills in some holes that maybe you had as you were watching the movie, or maybe it answers some questions that you had as you were watching the movie. And if it doesn't do either of those, it'll simply add context to what you already saw, even if you didn't necessarily leave the movie with any questions. But as I read Goldfinger, it was really interesting to get a little background, for example, on some of the people that Goldfinger was negotiating with before he ended up gassing them to death in the film. Or of course, one of them ended up being crushed in a car compactor. But it was really interesting to get a little bit more background on some of the people that he was negotiating with as he was preparing to make his move on Fort Knox in Kentucky in the US. So it was really interesting to get, again, that little bit of background that you get in the book that maybe the movie just doesn't really have time to really go in and do that character development for secondary characters. And so I really enjoyed having the opportunity to read that book, and I look forward to reading more of the Ian Fleming books that correspond to some of the great Bond films that we've seen over the years. And so really excited about that. It's the second Ian Fleming book I've read. As you maybe saw in an earlier video, I did read the book Live and Let Die by Ian Fleming, which was one of actually my favorite Bond movies, though some people don't tend to rate it highly. I don't know why. Some people are so down on Live and Let Die, the film. I thought it was really good. I thought it was one of the better entries, and certainly I thought one of Roger Moore's better entries in the Bond series. And it also has one of the best Bond songs, Live and Let Die too. So that's something you might want to think about as you watch the Live and Let Die movie. Maybe go back and read the book and get you a little bit more context. And you have to remember, of course, as I said in the book review that I did for that one, that sometimes the context you have to consider when the book was written, because some things maybe don't translate as well today as maybe they did, you know, years and years and decades ago when that book was actually written. But if you haven't read the books by Ian Fleming, I would highly recommend that, especially if you're a big fan of the James Bond series. It'll give you some different insight as to how James Bond behaves and how some of the characters around him, you get a little bit more background on some of those characters and maybe understand them a little bit better as you watch the movie in the future. So if you get a chance, check it out. Goldfinger, one of my favorite Bond movies, maybe I believe the best overall Bond film in the entire series. I think The Spy Who Loved Me I put pretty close, but I put second, and some other great entries, of course, in the James Bond series, whether you're a fan, again, of Roger Moore, or you're a Sean Connery fan, or you're Team Timothy Dalton, or you're Team Pierce Brosnan, or you're running with Daniel Craig. Whoever you're running with, there are some great entries in the Bond series, and some of these books that correspond to some of the movies can really give you some great background and maybe help you appreciate the movies that you've watched just a little bit more.